Klaus. I work at the Forest Stewards Guild, and we're really glad to have all of you today on the line. I think this is really an important topic as we look forward into this relatively new century and the challenges that forest management is facing. And I think it's really exciting, and I was really pleased that the team was willing to present today. And we'll talk a little bit more about the exciting presenters we have and their particular work, but I wanted to do a little bit of background while we're waiting for a few more folks to join. For those of you who don't know, the Forest Stewards Guild is a nonprofit. I'm sitting here in Santa Fe. Our main office is here in Santa Fe, but we do work nationally, and we're lucky enough to have members and staff all across the country. Our mission is to both practice on the ground as well as promote ecologically, economically, and socially responsible forestry. And so we have a number of on-the-ground projects where we try to practice what we preach, but we also focus on trying to bring forward the rigorous science and place-based experience of folks doing good work all across the country. And I see someone noted the closed captions. So I will go ahead and take one moment here to enable that. I did this the other day.
Except I'm hearing no sound.
Oops, can you, looks like Van may have joined us there. Hang on one second.
Yes. Sorry, having computer problems.
Okay.
You know, and they always happen just before the meeting.
Yes, yes, exactly. Well, we can see you and hear you, so hopefully you can do the same. And Dakota, do you remember where the closed captions option is?
I am not seeing it on my end.
Oh, phooey. I'll just ask everyone's indulgence one moment here where I try to sort that out, because that can be very helpful to make sure everybody can learn, see, hear, etc. And I may have to.
And if we're unable to figure it out today, we can always enable it on the recording when we upload it to YouTube.
Okay, that may be, thank you for having a good backup there. And apologies, Owen, if we are not doing that as well as we should right now. Okay, I think I better keep us moving here, and I will try once I turn over the mic to get that going. So again, I'm just sort of giving a little background on the Forest Stewards Guild. And I think I'm going to jump ahead here. One of the reasons we're interested in the topic of old growth is because of our work with the Forest Stewardship Council. Forest Stewardship Council did a risk assessment for the controlled wood project under their certification. And one of the elements that they identified as a potential risk from sourcing controlled wood is old growth forests, particularly in the Pacific Northwest. And so we've been thinking about how to mitigate that risk with FSC certified companies and others. And one of the avenues for doing that is education and outreach. So we're thinking of this little mini series on managing for old forest or old growth characteristics as part of that education and outreach. And so along those lines, we had an event in December. Dr. Bill Keaton presented his view on managing for old growth characteristics in temperate forests globally. And a recording of that is available on the Guild's website and YouTube channel. And I'll put a link later in the chat window in case folks want to have access to that later. And then in February, we have a presentation by Dr. Klaus Putnam that he's titled Managing the Parts for the Sum, which again is kind of thinking about what we can do as land stewards to maybe push stands or forests towards older forest characteristics. So obviously today's topic fits right into this little mini series, and I'm going to stop sharing and let our team of presenters start their sharing. And we're really lucky today because we actually have 3 presenters who all worked on this research project that they'll be talking about, obviously. We have Dr. Van Kane, who is a research associate professor leading the Forest Resilience Laboratory within the Precision Forestry Cooperative in the School of the Environment and Forest Resources at the University of Washington. And the lab's work focuses on using airborne lidar data and other data sets to support forest management to improve resilience, assess the effects of wildfire, map wildlife habitat, and work like today that we'll see as well. We're also lucky to have Michael Case, who is a forest ecologist with the Nature Conservancy, and his research focuses on how climate change impacts species and ecosystems. His master's and PhD from the University of Washington, and he's worked academia, federal, nonprofit, and private sectors. So I think it's, I think this is the kind of topic that cuts across regardless of where you work. So I think that's great. And then we're also lucky to have Caden Chamberlain, who's a PhD student at the School of the Environment and Forest Sciences at the University of Washington. And coincidentally, Caden and I go back to when he was at NAU as well. So that's fun. His current research uses multi-scale remote sensing data sets to explore disturbance effects on forest structure and resilience. And he received his Bachelor's of Science in Forestry from Northern Arizona University. And he's been doing field-based restoration and conservation across the West in various positions for the last 5 years. So again, that mixed background, which I think is important for so much of our work. So with that, I will be quiet. I'll try to get the closed captions going in the background here. And I'll turn it over. I believe Dr. Van Kane is going to kick us off. Thank you.
Well, hello, as I am Van Kane. I have been working with airborne lidar data now to assess forest structure and to support management since about 2005. So about 16, 17 years so far. Caden, could you go to the next slide? So what the work we're going to present today is the newest phase of a long-term relationship between the Nature Conservancy and the University of Washington. And I want to set the stage here a little bit. In the 2000s, the ideas of doing landscape scale ecologically based forest restoration to accelerate conditions of old growth, improve fire resilience, multiple goals, started to become increasingly well developed. And my PhD advisor, Jerry Franklin, was one of the leaders in that effort. And I was very privileged to be in a lab of other then great students. They're still great, but they moved on. And TNC contracted with 3 of us to work on the initial planning for the Ellsworth Creek Preserve, which they purchased in 2003. And this was actually a very ambitious goal, as Michael will describe in detail. They purchased land that included some incredible old growth, but also included land that had been heavily managed, stand replacing, harvest, and they set up a long-term experiment to monitor the effects of different treatments and accelerating the development of characteristics that are necessary towards developing structural complexity. Now, clearly in 10 or 20 years, you're not going to develop the characteristics of old growth, but you can move forward to it. forward with it. And they put in an extensive plot network. I believe it was over 300 plots. And at the time, they actually put money into what was a fairly novel idea, which was to fly airborne lidar so that they would get consistent measurements of the canopy across the entire preserve. And this included wildlife surveys. And now we're back in this year and last year evaluating the effects of the treatments that they put in. But in any case, TNC at that time, about 2005, 2006, contracted with myself to do a LiDAR analysis. And Andrew Larson, who's now with the University of Montana, and Derek Churchill, who's now at the Washington Department of Natural Resources, to write a management plan. Next slide, Caden. Now, I suspect that many of you on this call know the basics of airborne LiDAR, but just in case you don't, this is essentially very automated, very rapid fire laser range finding done in a way so that an instrument on a plane can map out in very high fidelity and high resolution the conditions of the vegetation canopy and of the ground below it. And you can see an example here of LiDAR data. This happens to be from the Sierra Nevada, but one of the reasons I like it is it shows that we can see canopy layering. For example, we can have a home identified in there. And we can see in this particular case, that homeowner has not done a good job of clearing brush from immediately around their house. But we can see the overstory structure. We can see down through the canopy layers all the way to the ground. Next slide. Now, I do want to just quickly mention some of the strengths of airborne LiDAR for forest management. We could have an entire seminar just on this topic, but I just wanted to set the stage on some strengths, and I also want to be very upfront on some weaknesses. So the strengths, we give very high fidelity mapping of canopy structure. The data sets that we're talking about today have the one in 2007, I believe, was 8 measurements per square meter, and each measurement on the ground is about the size of a pie plate. So if you can just imagine 8 of those in a square meter or about a square yard, you're effectively painting the entire canopy surface. And because there are always little gaps in the canopy, we can see the lower vegetation. Methods to do basic inventory metrics like basal area or biomass are very, very well developed, frequently applied. We can also use this to map features like canopy cover, gaps, tree heights, canopy layering. If you have multiple LiDAR acquisitions, as we have for the study that Michael and Caden will be talking about today, is superb for change detection, as you'll see. And I mentioned here structure-dependent habitat. What I mean by that is many forest species do select their habitat based on the forest structure around them. Spotted owls, for example, are a species that do that. So are many others. And when that is true, it is an excellent way to assess your landscape for habitat. Some weaknesses. LiDAR cannot do tree species identification. Oftentimes when we look at the LiDAR, we can personally see that, oh, this is a Doug fir or that is a red cedar. But there's never been a good automated way of doing that over a large area. Something that we also can't do, which is tree list. We can often map out the overstory trees. You can see the little figure on the bottom with the overstory trees. And here overstory means any tree visible directly to the sky. We can do a pretty good job of mapping those. But while we can detect the presence of overtop trees as a canopy layer, We can individually identify them, so we can't give the tree lists that go into, for example, FBS. In understory vegetation, we can characterize it broadly. We can tell you if there's little to none, some, or a lot, but that's about what we can do. So the best measurements are the top of canopy in the overstory structure, and then we can tell you if there's layering in approximately in broad bends, how much. Next slide. And at this point, I think we're turning this over to Michael.
Awesome. Thanks, Van. That was a great overview. Okay, so for my part of the presentation, I'm just going to give you an overview of Ellsworth Creek Preserve, which is located in the yellow circle on this map, so at southwest Washington. And it's in this area called the Willapa Hills region. Next slide. So I'm going to zoom in here a little bit to the Willapa Watershed. That's the area in blue on the map on the right side. And the little yellow specks on this map indicate the area of remaining old growth in this region. So the entire watershed's about like 700,000 acres or so. And the amount of old growth that exists still is less than 1/4 of 1%. So it's not much to say the least, right? So back in the late 1990s, TNC was approached by this guy named Rex Zach. And Rex, I don't know him personally, but he's a passionate historian, and he lives there locally. And he contacted TNC and alerted us about one of these last remaining chunks of old growth, the area that red arrow is pointing to on the map. And it was going to be logged. It was slated to be logged by this Timber Investment Management Organization, TIMO for short. And Rex, it's a great story. I don't have time to go into it now, but he basically persuaded this TIMO not to log this old growth area, okay? And with the help of some money from the Paul Allen Family Foundation, TNC was able to purchase this 300 acres or so. Now, I laugh because Rex is he's pretty persuasive guy, I guess, and he convinced TNC that 300 acres was good. It's a good start. Protected that old growth, but it wasn't going to solve the old growth deficit that this region and across the western Washington area wasn't going to solve that issue. And so he convinced TNC to buy the entire watershed that this chunk of old growth existed in. And that is what we refer to as Ellsworth Creek Preserve. Next slide. So I'm gonna flash forward a little bit. So TNC purchased this watershed, which is the area in green, dark green on this map on the left side here. That old growth that I was referring to is that super dark green color on the map. Okay, so it's kind of a small area within that larger landscape. And TNC purchased this area, and we had the goal that we're going to restore these old clear cuts to something that has the look and feel of old growth, but, and here's the clincher, we didn't want to wait 1,000 years for that to happen, right? We're a pretty impatient organization, and so this Ellsworth Creek Preserve, it not only acts as a preserve, as the name implies, but it also acts as this living laboratory that allows us to test some of these restoration strategies, and really allows us to think big and answer some really difficult science questions. Next slide. Okay, so this is the reality. This is what most of the preserve looked like, or currently looks like. Okay, so I mentioned it was clear cut, and a lot of these areas, were cut multiple times. So it's definitely been used. It was industrial land, and they have they look and feel a lot different from their old growth counterparts, obviously, okay? And we know that the functions, the processes that occur are also probably different. And our challenge was how different? And more importantly, how do we restore some of those functions, okay? And importantly, how does, these forests that were once clear cuts, how did they sequester carbon, filter water, and provide some of that important wildlife habitat that Van referred to? One of the species, endangered species that we have at Ellsworth Creek is marbled murrelet. And so we're challenged by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to not only to preserve existing habitat, but also try and promote more habitat for that species. Next slide, please. And so this is what we're trying to achieve, okay, right? This is these are some of the photos from our old growth area within Ellsworth Creek, and it gives us it gives us a baseline. It gives us something to strive for, okay. You'll notice there's a diversity of tree sizes. The picture by the creek there's abundant understory. There's diversity of that understory. There's well-developed structure, large woody debris. So all of this together creates this wildlife habitat that we're trying to achieve. And importantly, healthy streams for salmon. This is Ellsworth Creek. The creek that runs through Ellsworth Creek Preserve is salmon bearing. So that's another important target that we have with our management. Next slide. Okay, so question is, how do you convert these? A lot of times they're single species industrial forests to a complex and diverse old growth forest. And totally being honest here, we're not sure. I'm sure that doesn't surprise you. So what do? We experiment, right? We experiment with restoration strategies and tactics, and then we test those. And we do this, we can't do this by ourselves, right? So we have to partner with some of our federal and academic collaborators. Van and Caden are great examples of this. We would not be able to do this work without their assistance. And we leverage, the assistance from a science advisory group that we set up early in the 2000s, and they helped us design and implement an experimental design at Ellsworth. And again, the goal was really to evaluate and assess the effectiveness of our restoration strategies. Next slide. All right, so this map on the left here delineates the 3 restoration pathways that we replicate across Ellsworth Creek watershed, okay? So I'll go into more detail on each of these, but they're passive restoration, active restoration, and control. This picture is about the control, okay? So we have 3 controls. The map's kind of small, so I apologize for that, but there's one in the north, one in the center, and then one at the south. And in these control areas, we don't do any forest management, okay? So we're not going in there and doing any thinning, but we do maintain those roads. And really, we have to improve a lot of these roads because they've been degraded. And that allows us access to get in there and do other important things like upgrade culverts and stuff like that. So that's our control. Basically, leave it alone, except for the roads. Next slide. This is our passive treatment, okay? So these are treatments where they're very similar to the control in that we're not doing any thinning, we're not cutting trees down, but we're removing the roads, okay? So we've decommissioned, this is really big, we've decommissioned almost 26 miles of roads at Ellsworth, which kind of blows my mind, but it is important, we feel that it's important because it has direct impacts on the stream and water quality. Okay, I mentioned the salmon, they're in the creeks, and we are trying to evaluate how much decommissioning roads has an effect, hopefully a positive effect, on not only salmon, but things like amphibians and other critters that live in these creeks. Okay, so that's the second pathway, passive. Next slide. And then the last one here, this is kind of the exciting one. This is the active treatment. Okay, this is where we go into the woods with chainsaws and we're cutting down trees. So we're actively managing these stands. Of course, we're constantly improving and maintaining those roads so we can continue to go back and do more active treatments. And I'll go into a little bit more detail about what those treatments look like. But you get a sense for, these are the areas that we're doing restoration work. Not only the roads, but the actual forest restoration work. Okay, next slide. All right, so restoration treatments. So in those active basins, those areas that we are implementing restoration, we focus on doing, we call them variable density treatments. Okay, some of you are probably familiar with that silvicultural term. Basically what that means is we go in there and we're thinning from below. So we're generally taking small, maybe mid-range size trees. Okay, and we're doing that with skips and gaps. So there are some areas that we don't cut at all. Okay, those are our skips, and that might be because there's unique species assemblages or composition in those areas. Maybe it's a wet area, a forested wetland or something like that, but we'll leave those areas alone. And then there's other areas that we have gaps. These are small gaps, but they are gaps in the canopy. And a lot of times we're trying to maybe mimic the natural disturbance of wind in some of these areas. So some of the trees that we focus on, most of the preserve is dominated by western hemlock and Sitka spruce. And so when we go into a stand, we generally target western hemlock. It's generally a shorter lived species than spruce, and there's a lot of it. So we generally go for that one first. And then if there are areas that there are Doug fir, and a lot of the Douglas fir has been planted by our predecessors, the industrial forest landowners that once owned this area. And Douglas fir doesn't do so good on the coast. It really gets affected by Swiss needlecast, and particularly when it's very humid, which this area, because of its proximity to the ocean, it is very humid throughout the year. It's very susceptible to that. So that's a species that we might target, kind of on that second tier of removal. So western hemlock and then Douglas fir in some areas. And we try and retain as much of the red alder, western red alder, the Sitka spruce that I mentioned, and western red cedar, which is not too much, but historically there was a lot of western red cedar. And in fact, that's what dominates our old growth areas at this preserve. And so in general, we try and avoid cutting the hardwoods when we go in and do these active thinnings. We try and avoid having adverse impacts on the saplings or seedlings in some of these areas. We try and minimize the disturbance and removal of the understory and the shrub layers. And that means that we have to work super closely with the loggers, right? Like there has to be very clear communication and pretty close monitoring. So that's a really kind of high overview of the treatments and what we're doing at Ellsworth. And now the really cool part, Caden's going to talk about the lidar science and detecting changes over time. Caden.
All right. So yeah, hi everyone, and thank you, Van and Michael, for introducing things. And again, thanks Xander and the Forest Stewards Guild for hosting us. So at this point, I'd like to dive into talking about the manuscript that we recently published in the Journal of Forest Ecology and Management. And this was authored by myself, Van and Michael. And so this was a LiDAR-based study focused on Ellsworth Creek Preserve, of course. And like Michael said, we were really evaluating restoration treatments in terms of their effectiveness at accelerating the development of structural complexity. So today I'll spend about 25 minutes First, going into some of the background and impetus for our project, I want to spend some time discussing airborne lidar data in more detail and how it can be used to characterize forest structure. And then I'll go over some of our key findings and finish up with management implications. So this is somewhat of a recap from what Michael and Van said, but I just want to start with some background on our research. So as many of us know, we've seen this massive reduction of late successional forests in the Pacific Northwest since Euro-American settlement. One study estimated an 82% loss of this successional stage. And this is because many of our forested landscapes, as we know, at one point in time have been converted to production style forest plantations. And this loss of late successional forests is especially alarming because we know just how important these forests are. So for example, like Michael mentioned, they provide key wildlife habitats. They regulate important biophysical processes like the carbon cycle. They contribute to higher biodiversity, and they also just have some intrinsic social value associated with them due to their uniqueness. And so this map on the right is an estimate of where the greatest deficit in late successional forests exists. And I just want to point out that this study found the coastal region of the Northwest to be especially lacking in these late successional forests, and that happens to be where Ellsworth Creek Preserve is. So as managers and scientists in the region began to recognize this deficit of late successional forests over the past few decades, management practices really began to shift toward both maintaining existing late successional forests, but also attempting to restore secondary forests to late successional stages, specifically through the management of forest structure. And so to review, forest ecosystems are commonly defined by their structure, their composition, and their function. But forest management will often focus on forest structure since it's the easiest component to alter through management, and because structure can often serve as sort of a proxy for composition and function. And for our study, we define forest structure as the horizontal and vertical distribution of live and dead foliage, branches, and trees. So in the image on the right here, we have an illustration. This is from Bob Van Pelt of some characteristic late successional forests. And we notice the high vertical and horizontal complexity in this illustration. So for example, we see several strata from regeneration all the way up to these old decadent trees. We see canopy gaps of different sizes and ages. And we also notice some snags and coarse woody debris, which are important elements for wildlife. And so it's really these structural characteristics that give late successional forests a lot of their social and ecological value. So as management strategies and perspectives began to shift over the past few decades, there came about sort of a theory, which we term the accelerated succession theory in the paper, which suggests that if strategically designed restoration treatments are applied to simplified forest stands, they can accelerate the development of structural complexity, which will then allow these stands to meet management objectives faster than if left to natural processes alone. So this is a diagram on the slide here from our manuscript, which illustrates this theory. So on the left, we see a simplified 60 to 80-year-old forest stand, which is a common outcome of production style forestry in the region. And this stand has low vertical and horizontal complexity. But if we implement restoration treatments that reduce tree density and produce gaps of varying sizes, we expect late successional characteristics to develop faster than if we relied solely on natural processes alone. So over the past few decades, there have been several field-based and simulation-based studies that have explored this theory. And overall results indicate that restoration treatments can indeed accelerate this trajectory. Hence, treatments like these being applied more frequently on federal lands and at places like Ellsworth Creek. But importantly, many of these past studies relied on field-based plot level metrics of forest structure. And those are certainly valuable metrics, but they don't necessarily tell the entire story about the sort of the distribution of structural complexity and gap patterns across managed stands. And so that's where our study comes in. So several stands, as we know now within Ellsworth Creek Preserve, received restoration treatments, and this was around 2010. And so we had a unique opportunity to study the effects of these treatments using airborne lidar data from both pre and post treatments. And as Van alluded to at the beginning, airborne lidar is uniquely suited for characterizing the distribution of structure metrics across forest stands. So then using these airborne lidar data sets, we sought to answer two primary questions for our study. First of all, to what degree did restoration treatments shift forest structure and gap patterns compared to untreated stands? And then secondly, how do forest structure and gap patterns in treated stands compare to the nearby late successional areas in the preserve? Okay, so this is again some recapping of what Michael discussed, but I want to introduce the study area in the context of our manuscript. So on the left, this is a nice image here of Ellsworth Creek Watershed, which again hosts these highly productive forests that are dominated by western hemlock and Sitka spruce and western red cedar, and then to a lesser extent, some red alder and Douglas fir. And so we focused our analyses on these northern two experimental basins. So in the blue, we have the active basins here. And then in the yellow, we have the control basins where no treatments were implemented. And then we selected a subset of stands within these experimental basins for our analyses, which was really just to balance our data sets by age and area. And those are the hash marked stands within these basins. And then also a very important area of the preserve is the brown area on the map, which represents these late successional forested areas. And these areas represent preserved primary forests that are estimated to be about 500 to 1,000 years old and have that representative complex forest structure. All right, so on the next few slides, I'd like to describe airborne lidar data in a bit more detail, and specifically how it can be used to quantify forest structure. And as Van mentioned, this is really what our lab focuses on at UW. So airborne lidar data is collected by an aircraft. In Ellsworth Creek, we had one collection in 2007, and then another collection in 2018. And the user is then provided with a geo-referenced point cloud from the vendor representing the 3D structure of the canopy and ground surface. We can then use software. In our lab, we use R and Fusion to process these geo-referenced point clouds and produce raster layers representing different aspects of forest structure. And it's common for us to produce hundreds of metrics for a single LiDAR acquisition, but then it's important to select a few key metrics for a given study based on their ecological importance, and then also just the research questions that are being asked. So for this study, we selected 6 primary metrics shown over here on the left. And based on past literature, we know these metrics are useful for characterizing forest structure in successional stages. So in this image on the right here, we are showing a side view of a point cloud. And for example, we can calculate the canopy cover from this point cloud based on which points intersect the canopy and which points do not. We can also calculate dominant canopy height based on the return height points. And then we can even estimate the regeneration density based on the relative density of points in the lower strata. And so then for our analyses, we also wanted to focus on the vertical and horizontal structural complexity. And so to characterize this, we selected canopy rumple index and fractal dimension index. So in the image on the left here, this is an example of a fine resolution canopy height model derived from a lidar point cloud. And canopy rumple is then produced from this canopy height model and describes the rugosity of the surface. So for example, this area here in the light green has a low rumple index value of about 1.5, and that's because it has low complexity. Whereas this area here has a higher vertical complexity and then thus a higher canopy rumple value, around 4.3. So for our study, we also wanted to describe horizontal complexity of the canopy. And so for this, we used the fractal dimension index. And then we also looked at gap patterns. So the fractal dimension index, this is also derived from the canopy height model, and essentially describes how fractured the canopy is. So with a value closer to 1, describing a homogeneous canopy, like the image on the left here, and then a value closer to 2, describing a more fractured canopy, like the image on the right here. And then lastly, we quantified canopy gaps from the lidar canopy height model. And we know canopy gaps are an important component of late successional forests, and luckily lidar is uniquely suited to detect these. So in the image on the right here, we show some canopy gaps for a section of late successional forest within the preserve. And then from these gaps shown in gray here, we can analyze the area and the density of these gaps. And finally, after applying these forest structure metric equations across an acquisition, we produce raster layers representing each of these metrics. And then from these rasters, we can then derive things like density distribution curves, which represent all values from a certain metric within a given region of interest. So density distribution curves shown there. So that concludes sort of the crash course in lidar derived forest structure. And so then the last thing before diving into our results, just to make sure we're on the same page. So for our study, again, we use these 6 lidar derived forest structure metrics shown here. And we first assessed how restoration treatments shifted those structure metrics compared to controls. So we looked at between 2007 and 2018, how did the shifts in these metrics compare between the blue areas on the map and the yellow areas? And then we compared the 2018 structure in the treated stands against the structure in the existing late successional stands to see how well the treatments actually did. And so this was comparing forest structure in the blue zones here against the brown. Okay, so now to finally dive into our results. So first, to answer the question of to what degree did restoration treatments shift forest structure and gap patterns compared to untreated stands? So here I want to orient you all to these figures. So on the top row, we're showing the treated stands here. And then on the bottom row, we're showing the untreated stands or the controls. And each column then represents a forest structure metric derived from the lidar. And then within each plot, we're showing the density distribution of raster values for a given metric. And then the yellow, we show the distribution for pre-treatment conditions. And then in the blue, we're showing the distribution for post-treatment. And then the last thing is this OD value, which represents overlap difference. And this was our way of quantifying the difference between the distributions. So a higher value indicates more of a difference between the pre and post-treatment conditions. Okay, so first I want to point out where we did see considerable change resulting from the treatments. So the treatments primarily resulted in an increase in the mean and the variability of canopy rumple. And the second column here, and again, that's our vertical complexity. And we also saw a decrease in canopy cover in this fourth column, and then an increase in the mean and variability of fractal dimension index, which is our horizontal complexity shown in this last column. And this is compared against the untreated stands on the bottom row here, where we see much less shift in all three of these metrics. Okay, so next I want to point out where we did not see a difference between the treated and untreated stands. So canopy heights in the first column here shifted similarly between treated stands and untreated stands, with both showing about 10 meters of growth over the 10-year period. And then also regeneration density shown in this third column here did not increase considerably more in the treated stands compared to the untreated stands, with both having similar overlap difference, as you can see. Okay, here we're showing the results from our analysis of the canopy gaps. So again, on the top row, we have the treated stands, and then on the bottom row, the untreated stands. And again, we have yellow as pre-treatment conditions and blue as post-treatment conditions. And the primary takeaway here is that treatments resulted in an increase in the number of larger gaps. And we can see that in this part of the distribution curve here. And then also an increase in the percent forest area gap, as we can see here, and then an increase in the gap density as well. On the other hand, in the untreated stands on the bottom here, natural processes alone primarily resulted in a filling in of small gaps. So we see that this bar dropping in the small gap column here. And then just a minor increase in total forest area gap, and then a decrease in gap density. Okay, so exploring our first set of results, the major takeaway is that treatments did indeed increase both vertical and horizontal complexity of the canopy, which is good and what we expected. But beyond this, we still wanted to know how structure in the treated stands compared to that in the late successional stands, which really represent sort of our long-term structural targets. And so this one figure here shows all of our comparisons between the treated stands and the late successional stands. In blue, again, we have the treated stands, and then in brown, we have the late successional stands. So on the top row, we're again looking at the density distributions of our forest structure metrics. And the major takeaway is that our treated stands are overall fairly dissimilar from the late successional stands, which isn't necessarily that surprising considering the age difference and the history of the two stands. But more specifically, we see that canopy height over here in this column is about 15 meters less in the treated stands. Regeneration density is much lower and less variable compared to the late successional stands. And then interestingly, on the right here, we see fractal dimension index was actually much higher and more variable in the treated stands, which we attribute to the gap patterns. So then looking at the gap patterns on the bottom row here, we actually see that treated stands had higher gap density and total gap area compared to the late successional stands. But importantly, the distribution of gap sizes was actually relatively similar between the two stand types. And we can see this based on the shape of this distribution between the blue and the brown. And so this tells us that treatments produce the right proportion of gap sizes, but perhaps too many gaps in each size class. So overall, the results suggest that several more decades of growth filling in and maintenance of canopy gaps, and increased regeneration density are all needed in the treated stands before they meet these long-term structural targets of late successional stands. So in this image, I'm hoping to tie our results back to what Michael mentioned earlier in terms of sort of what we had, what we have now, and then what we're striving for. And these images on the top, again, show a canopy height model derived from the lidar, which is a nice visualization of the canopy complexity and gap patterns. And all images are from 2018, so post-treatment conditions. So in the control units over here on the left, we still see a relatively homogeneous, dense canopy, maybe a few gaps in there, but then also relatively short canopy height, around 40 meters. In the middle here, in the treated stands, we see a more fractured canopy with several large gaps and increased complexity. But still, canopy height is relatively low and similar to the control. And then lastly, in the late successional stands here on the right, we see a somewhat less fractured canopy, but we still see a decent number of canopy gaps representing various sizes across the stand. And we also notice many more large trees shown in the darker green here. But we also see areas of shorter canopy that are intermixed, and those sort of represent our different age cohorts. And then on the bottom, just some nice images from the preserve representing these different conditions. Okay, so here I just wanted to summarize all of our results in one sort of blanket takeaway. So based on our analyses, we believe that the treatments at Ellsworth represent a good first entry treatment, which more or less shifted stands from a single age homogeneous canopy to a two-aged and more complex canopy. However, if we compare these treated stands to late successional areas, it's clear that treated stands are not entirely on the trajectory towards the multi-age structural complexity of late successional forests. So to reach these targets, we expect first that treated stands will simply need to grow taller over time, which we expect to be somewhat accelerated due to the more favorable conditions resulting from the canopy gaps. But second, our results should suggest the need for future treatments or natural disturbances that will create growing space for a third and a fourth cohort to establish, while also preserving the large and increasingly decadent older cohort of trees. So one way I personally see this playing out is to have a second entry treatment, perhaps in 10 or 20 years, that will focus on producing additional gaps by removing some older trees and some of the recently established younger trees, all while maintaining a similar distribution of gap sizes across the stand. And this second entry may be similar to sort of a light group selection treatment. Then perhaps 40 or 60 years from now, a final treatment might be applied that produces a scattering of small gaps across the stand, sort of like a single tree selection treatment. And this will allow a fourth cohort to then establish. And so at that point, we might expect these stands to represent fairly high levels of structural complexity. And this complexity will likely persist through time as long as natural disturbances like wind and pathogen are still influencing stand structure. So that's one possible set of treatments that could move these stands towards meeting structural targets. But of course, there are many options. And I think some future simulation studies are definitely needed to really determine the best options moving forward. But I do want to emphasize that overall, I would argue that these initial treatments in Ellsworth did indeed set the stage well for future treatments that will continue to accelerate the development of structural complexity. Okay, and finally, to wrap things up, I wanted to just point out some major limitations quickly of our study. The most important one is just that our results still only represents a relatively short time frame. And so future studies and monitoring will definitely still be needed to assess long-term effects. Secondly, as Van mentioned at the beginning, we recognize that LIDAR is super good at some things, but not so great at other things, such as measuring understory species, coarse woody debris, and snags. And so fortunately, there are other studies currently underway at Ellsworth, which Michael knows a lot more about. And those studies rely on field data and other techniques, and they'll definitely serve as a nice supplement to this remote sensing-based study. And then lastly, it's common to analyze and manage forest for forest structure. But I think it's important to note that structure is not always a perfect proxy for composition or function. And so perhaps other monitoring and measuring techniques will be needed to fully understand restoration effectiveness from multiple perspectives. All right, and we're zeroing in on the hour here. So with that, I'd like to wrap things up and again say thank you, Xander, and the Forest Stewards Guild for giving us the opportunity to share our study here. Personally, I just wanted to thank the Nature Conservancy and the School of Environmental and Forest Sciences at UW for funding this project. And we've listed our email addresses up here. So yeah, we encourage people to reach out with any questions that they have. And I think that's it. So it didn't go as fast as we had hoped. We got 2 minutes maybe for questions, but.
And we can, if whoever can stick around, we can go a little bit over time. Thank you so much. That was great. It's really neat to see this whole story. Jumping into a couple of questions that came in the chat window, Laurel asked about you are targeting in the variable density thinning treatments, the largest diameters to leave. Is that correct?
Yeah, definitely. We always tried to leave the biggest trees. Some of the exceptions to that might be where we did cable yarding. So the corridors along the cable corridor might be, have a tree that we'd have to take that was on the larger side. But in most cases, we tried to leave them.
Yeah, that makes sense. And Laura asked if you could just remind us all how long after the treatment the LIDAR data was collected.
Yeah, so treatments were applied, I think, between like 2008 and 2011. And so then the LIDAR was collected in 2018. So anywhere from 7 to 10 years post-treatment.
Okay. And then Rose asked about seedling recruitment. Maybe you can remind us how the seedling recruitment compared in the treated versus the old growth plots.
Yeah, I can start off on that and then maybe pass it to Michael. So based on our analysis, and this is strictly from LIDAR, we saw that regeneration density was relatively low in the treated stands, especially compared to the late successional stands. And I talk about this in the manuscript, but I think it maybe comes down to some limitations of LIDAR data, especially in these more dense canopies. So, LIDAR is great at capturing the upper canopy information, but it can fall apart in the lower strata. And so, like I said, I think we've established sort of a 2-age stand structure here. And part of that comes from just talking with Michael, who's been out there in the field and is reporting abundant regeneration, which wasn't necessarily picked up by the LIDAR. So I don't know if you want to fill in there, Michael.
Yeah, I'll just jump in super quick, just to give people a kind of a visual field trip, if you will. If you walk through the control areas where we didn't do the thinning, there's basically no understory, right? There's just no regeneration coming up. You go into the areas that we thinned, especially in those gaps that we created, there's abundance of understory and regeneration. Now, a lot of that is hemlock, and it just shoots up everywhere. It's like a carpet, if you will. One of the studies that we have going on kind of in parallel to this project is a seedling recruitment study. So we have seed traps out there in the control, in the thinned, in the old growth. And if anybody knows of any good seed counters out there and is looking for an internship or something, send them my way. I'd be happy to entertain that. But that is an ongoing piece of our research right now.
Great, and I want to recognize we're at the hour. I think some people may need to drop off, but for those who can stick around, maybe we'll try to do one or two more questions. And again, we'll have one more in our mini series in February, a webinar with Dr. Klaus Putnam. So definitely register for that. Hopefully we'll see many of you back. So William Vogel asked about future treatments, and he said, won't treatments need to be quite heavy in order to grow and keep large branches for murrelet to avoid future self-pruning of branches?
Yeah, Michael, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, I think, that's something that is so specific for marbled murrelet, right? Like they need these big branches for their nesting platforms. And I don't know if there's a way to necessarily increase the diameter growth of big branches aside from giving those existing trees a little more growing space, right? Like if you cut some of the other trees around that, maybe that will open it up a little bit. But then there are trade-offs with, the density of those large trees in a given stand. So, I would really look to a wildlife biologist to, try and work with us on that one. And the Fish and Wildlife Service, they do have some great professionals, biologists that are working on some of the treatment types. And my colleague, Kyle Smith, has been working really closely with them to try and design some of these treatments. But that's a very specific management objective, right?
Yeah, a lot of competing objectives in all our work. Let's see. So Andrew asked about regeneration. Regeneration seems like a critical metric, and he's calling in from the Northeast. So obviously a different system. Clearly, industrial stands are focused on planting. And what is known about the mechanisms for regeneration in these old growth stands, and what would need to be done to mimic those methodologies besides just creating gaps?
Yeah, I mean, I think like Michael was saying, that we do, currently see abundant regeneration. And I think in these forests, they're so highly productive that, the gaps that we're creating aren't enormous enough that there's a distance from seed source issue. And so there is seed available. And then just because of the, highly productive growing conditions, it's super moist and wet. It does seem like creating the gaps is enough to establish that lower cohort.
Yeah, and I just might add to that, a lot of the Western red cedar is very tolerant of closed canopy. So it grows well when there is still a closed canopy in there. And historically, a lot of these old growth areas are dominated by Western red cedar. So gaps are important. Historically, they were created by wind, but Western red cedar will still do well in areas that don't receive a lot of gap creation.
Great. Maybe one last one here. Laurel, let's see, wait, missed one, sorry. Laurel asked, at what point would the benefit of doing restoration-based treatments on homogeneous, dense control plots outweigh the benefits of long-term ecological research? So obviously for research, you need these controls, but on the other hand, this is a really, you're making real good progress, and it's be nice to breakers, right?
Yeah, boy, that's a really tough question, and that's a question that I can't really answer. You know, I think that there are so many trade-offs, and you know, having the bigger picture of how this work can help spur others in the region to do similar work, I think is so important. There aren't a ton of experimental forests, in particularly in Western Washington. And so I think what we can contribute to that knowledge base is maybe, I don't know, maybe that's really important, and maybe we keep those controls for a while because we don't really know the true effects of what we're doing until, you know, years and years down the road.
Yeah, let's see if you guys will indulge one last here. I think just a quick detail. Could you repeat the range of gap sizes, sort of the goals, and the what you actually saw once the work is implemented in the treated areas?
Yes. So let's see. So maybe I guess I can just share again quickly the screen. So this is on the bottom row, looking at the gaps again. And so the brown here is representing the distribution of gap sizes. So we see sort of this inverse J shape here, dominated still by smaller gaps. So those are gaps of 0.01 hectare. But then a decent distribution of some of these larger gaps. And the point I was trying to make here is that, you know, the treatments did actually mimic this curve, the shape of this curve pretty well, but it's just kind of too much of one. And so I think, you know, that's when we're talking about future treatments, I think it's important to think about how we can maintain that distribution of sizes. But in the long term, kind of reduce the total area. And so I think that will happen as these gaps fill in with cohorts of different ages.
Yeah, it's such an interesting situation to be in, and trying to mimic, you know, nature basically, right? But also balancing the economic side of, you know, of the cost of going in and doing a commercial fitting, and, you know, really making it pencil out so that you can pay for future harvests. And it's there's just so many variables. It's really fun to think about all of those in, you know, at the same time in place.
And that's maybe a good note to end on. I think this is great work, just the sort of silviculture I'm interested in. So I want to thank you all again for presenting. It's great. We had a great set of participants, and I'll have the recording out kind of as soon as I get to it. And hopefully many of you can join us in February for a follow-up webinar. So thanks again, everyone.
Yeah,
Thank
you all
you.
so much. And please reach out with questions. We're happy to follow up on anything.
Great, thanks.